Let me get reactions from our corporates here on the panel. And Mukesh Butani, several things that Mr. Jaitley said over there, that this is really an optical exercise, an illusion that the government has presented in terms of tax collections and so on and so forth. There is some merit to that argument, because if we were to only look at the tax collection numbers, the shortfall for the last 3 years, 6%, 5%, 7%, how do we actually get to that 20% that they've budgeted for?
So I think besides the math on fiscal deficit, I think the more worrisome part clearly is where the revenues are going to come from. Last year he budgeted an 18% increase in tax revenues on the back of 6.5% growth that they projected. They've fallen short. They revised the budget estimates. Excise duties are flat. Corporate tax is only 10%. Next year, with a growth rate of 6%, he's estimating 19% tax collection. I think it's way ahead of what ordinarily one would sit and estimate. I can't imagine, even if you carry out deep tax administrative reforms, I can't imagine that we will
anyway, deep tax administrative reforms will now be taken forward by the next government. It cannot happen under them.
And even these reforms, even if you look at the TAC recommendations, it's going to be rolled out over a period of 3 to 5 years. You will not be able to witness the kind of uplift in the tax revenue collection as you would expect. I mean, certainly not 19% tax collection. So I don't know how these maths is adding up, and it's worrisome. The other worrisome part is that tax to GDP has been consistently dropping. The budget figures give you the gross tax receipts to GDP. They don't give you the net tax receipts to GDP, because that's the right indicator to measure it. So I think it's an extremely worrisome situation for next year as to whoever is going to bell the cat next year, to come out with these figures. It's going to be a real challenge.
Sumant Sinha, and we've been talking about this, that whoever comes into power, whatever political dispensation, to be able to arrive at the fiscal deficit number that has been laid out as far as the interim budget is concerned is going to be a challenge. These numbers are not necessarily sacrosanct, because you will have a full budget whether it's June or July. But on the face of it, will you give Chidambaram credit today for at least being able to deliver on the fiscal deficit number, and more credit for being able to deliver on the current account? Fiscal deficit, we can accuse him of jugglery and all of that, but on the current account deficit, would you at least give him credit?
Yeah, look, Shereen, I think that, Mr. Chidambaram was dealt a very strong hand when he took over in 2004. And conversely, he was dealt a very weak hand when he took over more recently. And I think in the last year and a half, in the backdrop of a tightening Fed, very vulnerable sort of global macroeconomic situation, I think he's done as much of a yeoman's job as was possible in this kind of a context. The current account deficit had ballooned up to 4.8% of GDP, and I think getting it back down to about 2.5%, I think is phenomenal, and I think that is actually what is going to end up saving us in the current environment. Our rupee is stable. Had the rupee not been stable, investments would not have been coming in. It would have actually been a fairly negative environment. So I think in that respect, he's at least been able to get the macroeconomics anchored a little bit more. And I think that gives us breathing room, at least gives the new government some breathing room, that at least things are not falling off a cliff.
So you don't agree with the BJP when they say that things are falling off the cliff, we're inheriting a messy economy and so on and so forth?
No, I think it is very messy when you look at the actual sort of details of what is happening. I'm just saying at a very headline number, at least the fiscal deficit and the current account deficit seem to be in some sort of control. They could have actually been spinning out of control as well, right?
Okay, Arun Maira, let's forget about the interim budget for a moment, because at the end of the day, what the next government decides to do as far as these numbers is a different story. What I want you to comment about is the vision for the future. And he articulated a 10-point agenda, if they were to come back to power. And frankly, if you look at this agenda and you look at the BJP's economic manifesto, there's really not much difference. I want to pick on manufacturing, for instance, and that was point number 6 that he made. He said all taxes that are exported should be waived. You've been working on the manufacturing policy for the last several years. We've been talking about hiking manufacturing to GDP to 25%, and yet none of the promises that the government had made to actually kickstart the manufacturing sector have been delivered on. Are you disappointed today?
Well, the finance minister is not responsible for the manufacturing plan or the implementation of the plan. So I wouldn't fault Mr. Chidambaram if manufacturing has not grown in the last 2 years or 3 years since we made the policy. But I would fault all of us. It hasn't grown actually. And let me say this. I was a bit disappointed when I read the finance minister's description of the manufacturing policy here. Because as far as I recollect, and I've been involved with making the manufacturing policy in the plan, that isn't the manufacturing policy in the plan. It describes the big manufacturing zones, it describes the industrial corridors along which infrastructure is going to be put and manufacturing will come up 5 or 10 years down the road when all that happens. But that's not what the country needs. The country wants jobs out of manufacturing now. The people are coming out of colleges now. So a manufacturing plan, which is based on the strategy of building infrastructure in these zones, is not going to deliver against the country's requirement. So we have a very good strategy, actually.
But he seems to have dumped that.
He hasn't dumped it. I think there's an ignorance, if I might say. I might say, Shereen, I get into being, not you, you're very good, but other anchors who ask me, and well, what's being done about the manufacturing policy? And I gently ask, like, what is the manufacturing policy? They say, all those zones, there's no land. I said, but that's not the policy.
But do you blame people for asking you that question, Mr. Maira? And I come back to a larger issue, which is, linked to what we've seen happen as far as manufacturing is concerned. The lack of a consistent message. That seems to be the problem. You take up one idea, you dump it halfway, you start a manufacturing policy, you dump it halfway. The lack of consistency, that's what seems to have plagued the UPA-II in its second tenure.
Well, I wouldn't say in this case dumping it halfway. I think there is a challenge that we all have as a country, that we are not engaging together on our national strategies, if I might say. So we've got to have some better processes for us, all of us understanding, well, what is the plan? And do we then support the plan? But first we have to understand what it is. So there's been a missing thing about what you might say coordination, collaboration, alignment. That has been our weakness. And it's been a chronic weakness, but it's been sort of more manifest more recently.
Right.
And we need to get our act together, if I can use that expression.
Oh, absolutely. You must use that expression. Let me go across to Sunil Munjal. Mr. Munjal, we can accuse the UPA of not having a consistent message, of, being poor as far as execution is concerned. Vinay Chatterjee, who was here in the studio with me a short while ago, summed it up really well. He said the problem that afflicted UPA-II was the decision paralysis-led slowdown. DPLS is what Vinay Chatterjee is calling it. We had a spirited discussion in Parliament, Mr. Chidambaram saying, I refute charges of policy paralysis. Kapil Sibal a short while ago in conversation with me also said, I refute charges of policy paralysis. But that is what weighed this government down at the end of the day.
I think there are two parts to this, Shereen. One is, to be fair to them, in the last 10 or 12 months, a lot of good decisions have been made, a lot of good policies have been announced. Before that, there was a definite slowdown, but even then, the good work which was being done by the government was never really publicized. There was no messaging outside to what's actually being done, which is productive, which is growth-oriented. So general impression was only about the negative stuff, only about the indecision, and only about the decisions which were being made and then changed. So that vitiated the atmosphere, and it certainly impacted India's image internally and also globally. We've seen a large number of global investors say, we would like to come and invest in India, but we would like to see policy statements which are consistent. We would like to see action which is in line with the policies that get announced. Now, it's not as if we've done nothing, but the impression we've given out, unfortunately, is really not good. And this last bit which is going on is, some say, too little too late. And going back to your earlier comment, the reality is today's vote on account is what it should have been, just a vote on account. I guess it's getting so much attention, partially because it is the last policy announcement opportunity for the current government, and partially because of the announcements on tax rebates which got announced today.